Hiya. I just wanted to talk for a few minutes about something that's been on my mind. A couple of news stories that have been in the press for the last week or two that don't appear to be connected, but have some very troubling connective tissue. The first is the terrible shooting in Pittsburgh in the synagogue that left about a dozen people dead. And the other story is the so-called caravan of Honduran refugees that are slowly working their way north through Mexico. Now, the shooter in Pittsburgh went on social media immediately before carrying out his crime, and said that he was motivated by a conspiracy theory. He didn't call it that, but a theory that this caravan of refugees is an invasion force, and that it is being manipulated and funded by Jews, which motivated him to go to a synagogue and kill a bunch of people. The name that's often associated with these Jewish conspiracies is George Soros. His name has become a kind of catch-all term for anything that people want to blame on Jewish conspiracies. Now, I don't know a lot about George Soros. I know that he funds a lot of progressive causes, but to my knowledge, he's always done so very transparently and publicly. They've not been secrets. He's given $32 billion of his own money to his charitable foundation, which is in the public realm. It's all transparent. You can see where he's spending his money, and the fact that he escaped with his family from the Nazis at the age of 4 or 5, I think inspired him to align himself politically with marginalized communities throughout his life. He was very active in South Africa during apartheid, funding scholarships. He was virulently anti-communist when there was a lot of communism in Europe, and funded a lot of efforts to combat communism and open people up to things the way things are done in the West. And he also gets behind initiatives serving communities like Romani Gypsy communities in Europe, who are incredibly marginalized. So I don't know that there's a lot of evidence to back up these bizarre conspiracies that he is this puppet master working behind the scenes, pulling the strings and making all of these things that conservatives hate happen. I just want to reflect a minute as well, and I think this is the main reason I wanted to do this little video. This idea of George Soros as a puppet master is a very old trope. Anti-Semitism goes back centuries, but in its modern incarnation, obviously the most historically relevant period to remember is the Holocaust. And leading up to the Holocaust, in order to persuade people that this was justified, that Jews needed to be exterminated, was a propaganda campaign against them, suggesting that they were, by their nature, inherently sinister, evil, greedy, manipulative people. I've got an example of the kinds of images that Nazis used to circulate to sort of drive this point home. Here you can see this sinister Jewish-type figure with jewels on his fingers in the background, pulling the strings of people wearing crowns. You've got somebody in what appears to be a naval uniform. I don't know if these were recognizable caricatures at the time. Perhaps they're politicians or aristocrats of some sort. But this idea that Jews are pulling the strings, they are the puppet masters, this is not a new trope. This has been going on for a long time. And it was used to turn people against the Jewish community and to make it seem acceptable that they were being targeted for extermination. Or at the time, they were being told they were just being forced out of the country. And I've got another image here. This is also from the early 20th century of another Jewish figure in the background working the strings. There are so many. If you just go on Google and do a search, you'll find loads of examples of this. That was the way that Jews were caricaturized at that time in order to make people turn against them, if they weren't already. But the thing is, this has reappeared. This has now been associated with George Soros in particular, and every bizarre conspiracy theory under the sun has utilized this. We know that a lot of people on the right believe that George Soros is secretly running the U.S. State Department somehow. Here's an image, a political cartoon to illustrate that, with disturbing anti-Semitic overtones. You've got George Soros being the puppet master for, that's McMaster and Petraeus. And you look and see what's operating Soros. We have a hand with the name Rothschild on it, which is another very wealthy and very powerful Jewish family. So you've got levels upon levels of Jewish puppet masters here working the strings of power. And it's gone mainstream. This is an image that it was circulated by the New York State GOP with George Soros as the puppet master with glowing red eyes, working the strings of, well, there's Hitler, which refers to the conspiracy theory that Soros was a collaborator, that he collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War, which would have been particularly challenging considering he was about 4 at the time. But it just gets weirder and weirder. You've got this idea that the NFL protests, kneeling during the national anthem, George Soros above them working the strings saying, yes, yes, just like that. These ideas to paint a sinister picture of someone that people know the name, but who knows a lot about George Soros, frankly. He's I can't help but associate what's being said now with what was the things that were said back then. These are really disturbing trends. They're used to dehumanize an entire religion, and they're also being used to frighten people who are sometimes unstable, sometimes have access to weapons. Even if that weren't the case, this is totally unacceptable. George Soros' name should not become a substitute for the old anti-Semitic slurs of the past. Throwing his name into a conspiracy theory just to give it some weight or some visceral reaction we're better than this. And we need to call it out where we see it. It's anti-Semitism, it's hateful, and it's unacceptable. It needs to stop. And I will continue to say so every time I see another picture of George Soros working the strings behind the scenes as a puppet master, because that's exactly what it is. It's anti-Semitism. Thank you for listening.